While surgeon husband was saving his mistress from suicide, his wife was flatlined on the operating table. Her cardiothoracic surgeon, father, ended his career with one phone call. Hook, she called her husband 67 times while her heart was stopping. He silenced every single one. While 36-year-old Caroline Mitchell was flatlining on an operating table at Boston General Hospital, her husband, Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, was 15 miles away, holding the hand of a woman she had never met, his mistress, his secret, his choice. Caroline's heart stopped beating for 4 minutes and 32 seconds that night. 4 minutes and 32 seconds of clinical death, while the surgical team fought to bring her back. 4 minutes and 32 seconds. That would have been her last if her father had not been the one holding the scalpel. Dr. Richard Hayes was 64 years old. He had spent 40 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon, the last 15 as chief of surgery at Boston General. He had saved over 3,000 lives. He had trained 2 generations of doctors. He sat on the medical licensing board for the state of Massachusetts. He had never operated on anyone while wanting to destroy another human being as badly as he wanted to destroy his son-in-law. But Jonathan Mitchell made one fatal mistake that night. He forgot that, in the world of medicine, reputation is everything, and the man whose daughter he had abandoned to die had the power to end careers with a single phone call. Value Lesson 1. Here is something I have learned from stories like this one. The people who hurt us the most are often the people we trusted the most. They do not wear signs warning us of their true nature. They wear wedding rings and white coats and smiles that feel like home. But here is what else I have learned. When someone shows you who they really are, when their mask finally slips and you see the stranger hiding behind the person you loved, that moment is not an ending. It is a beginning. The beginning of a life where you no longer have to pretend, where you no longer have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's lies. Caroline Mitchell almost died the night she discovered the truth about her husband. But in many ways, that was the night she finally started living. CTA. If you believe that karma always finds its way, if you love watching justice served to those who deserve it most, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Trust me, you will want to see how this surgeon lost everything, including his license, his reputation, and his freedom. Let us begin. Chapter 1. 67. Calls. The first sign that something was wrong came at 6:43 on a Thursday evening in November. Caroline Mitchell was in the kitchen of their Beacon Hill townhouse, chopping vegetables for dinner, when she felt a strange pressure in her chest. Not quite pain, more like someone pressing a fist against her sternum from the inside. She set down the knife and took a deep breath. The pressure eased slightly. Probably just stress, she thought. She had been working long hours at the architecture firm, trying to finish the design for a new children's hospital wing. The irony of that would not become clear until later. Caroline was 36 years old, healthy, active. She ran 3 miles every morning and did yoga twice a week. Her last physical had shown perfect blood pressure, perfect cholesterol, perfect everything. Heart attacks happened to other people, older people, people who did not take care of themselves. The pressure returned, stronger this time. It radiated up into her jaw, down her left arm. She gripped the edge of the counter, suddenly dizzy. She reached for her phone and called Jonathan. Her husband was a trauma surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the best in the city. He would know what to do. He always knew what to do. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. Caroline lowered herself carefully to the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets. The pressure was becoming pain now, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. She could feel her heart beating erratically, skipping and stuttering like a broken record. She called Jonathan again and again and again. By the 15th call, she had managed to dial 911. By the 20th call, the paramedics were breaking down her front door. By the 35th call, she was in the back of an ambulance, an oxygen mask over her face, watching the ceiling lights blur past as they wheeled her into the emergency room. She kept calling, even as the nurses cut away her clothes, even as the doctors shouted orders she could not understand, even as her vision began to tunnel and her thoughts grew slow and distant. 67 calls to her husband, not a single one answered. The last thing Caroline saw before everything went dark was her father's face, appearing above her like an angel in surgical scrubs, his eyes filled with a terror she had never seen before. Then her heart stopped, and the world went silent. Chapter 2, 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Dr. Richard Hayes had been in the hospital cafeteria when the code blue was called. He was not supposed to be working that night. He had cleared his schedule for a dinner with his wife, their 38th wedding anniversary. But Margaret had called an hour earlier with a migraine, asking if they could postpone until the weekend. So Richard had stayed late to catch up on paperwork, thinking he might as well be productive. When he heard the code called for the cardiac surgery suite, he had responded automatically. 40 years of training, 40 years of running toward emergencies instead of away from them. He did not know the patient was his daughter until he pushed through the doors and saw her face. Caroline. His Caroline. His little girl, who used to sit on his lap in this very hospital, watching him review charts, asking endless questions about how the heart worked. His Caroline, who had grown into a brilliant architect, a loving wife, a woman who made everyone around her feel valued and seen. She was lying on the table, her chest exposed, her skin pale as marble. The monitors showed a flat line. The surgical team was preparing for emergency intervention. Richard's training took over. He pushed aside the father and became the surgeon. How long has she been down? 90 seconds. Doctor, Hayes, sudden cardiac arrest. No warning signs. Get me the defibrillator. Prepare for emergency bypass. Move. The next 4 minutes and 32 seconds were the longest of Richard Hayes's life. He worked with mechanical precision, his hands steady even as his mind screamed. He opened his daughter's chest. He held her heart in his hands. He massaged it back to life with fingers that had saved thousands of strangers, but had never touched someone he loved this much. He shocked her heart once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The monitors showed nothing but flat, unbroken lines. Come on, sweetheart, he whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. Come back to me. Please come back to me. He shocked her a 4th time, and her heart began to beat. Weak at first, irregular, but beating, living, fighting. Richard repaired the damage, with tears streaming down his face behind his surgical mask. A congenital defect, hidden for 36 years, had finally made itself known. A small weakness in the wall of her heart that had chosen tonight of all nights to rupture. If she had been at home alone, if the paramedics had been 5 minutes slower, if any other surgeon had been on call tonight, she would be dead. When the surgery was complete, when Caroline was stable and breathing and alive, Richard stepped out of the operating room and collapsed against the wall. A nurse found him there 10 minutes later, still in his bloody scrubs, staring at his phone. "Dr. Hayes, is everything all right?" Richard looked up. His eyes were red, his face aged 10 years in a single night. "Where's her husband?" he asked. "Has anyone reached Dr. Mitchell?" The nurse checked her tablet. "We have been trying since she was admitted. He is not answering his phone. 67 calls from his dying wife, countless calls from the hospital. And Jonathan Mitchell had not answered a single one." "Find him," Richard said, his voice cold with a rage he had never felt before. "Find him and bring him here. Now!" Chapter 3. The truth: Jonathan Mitchell did not arrive at the hospital until 7:45 the next morning. He strode through the doors of the cardiac intensive care unit with a bouquet of roses and an expression of practiced devastation. His hair was perfectly styled. His clothes were fresh and pressed. He did not look like a man who had spent the night in agony, waiting for news of his wife. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a peaceful sleep. "Where is she?" he demanded, approaching the nurse's station. "My wife, Caroline Mitchell. I just got the messages. My phone was dead all night. I had no idea." The nurse directed him to Caroline's room, without comment. Richard Hayes was waiting inside, seated in the chair beside his daughter's bed. Caroline was unconscious, connected to a maze of monitors and IV lines. She was alive, but she looked fragile in a way that made Jonathan's stomach clench. Or perhaps that was guilt. "Richard, enough." Jonathan set the roses on the side table and moved to Caroline's bedside. "I am so sorry. I do not know what happened. My phone battery died during a conference, and I did not. Stop." The single word cut through the room like a surgical blade. Richard stood slowly, his eyes fixed on Jonathan's face, with an intensity that made the younger man take a step back. "Your phone was not dead," Richard said quietly. "You declined 67 calls from your wife while she was having a heart attack. I have seen the phone records." Jonathan's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. "That is not possible. I also know you were not at a conference." Richard pulled a photograph from his pocket and held it up. "This was taken at 11:32 last night, 15 miles from where your wife was dying." The photograph showed Jonathan sitting in a hospital waiting room. Not Massachusetts General, where he worked, a different hospital, a smaller facility on the outskirts of the city. And beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, was a woman with auburn hair and tear-streaked makeup. "Her name is Vanessa Cole," Richard continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. 29 years old, administrative assistant at your hospital. She was admitted to Westbrook Medical Center last night for an apparent suicide attempt. Except the attending physician noted that her injuries were superficial and inconsistent with genuine self-harm. Jonathan's mask cracked. Just for a moment, just enough for Richard to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "It is not what you think." "No?" Richard moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Then tell me what it is. Jonathan, tell me why you were holding your mistress's hand while my daughter was flatlining on an operating table. Tell me why you silenced her calls while her heart was stopping. Tell me why you let her die alone." "She did not die. She is right here." "She died for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Richard's voice broke on the last word. "I held her heart in my hands. I watched it stop beating. I brought her back because I happened to be in this hospital tonight. If I had gone to dinner with Margaret like I was supposed to, if any other surgeon had been on call, you would be a widower right now." Jonathan said nothing. There was nothing to say. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph. This one showed financial records, bank statements, wire transfers. Over the past 18 months, you have transferred nearly $200,000 to accounts in Vanessa Cole's name. You have paid for her apartment, her car, her credit card bills. You have taken trips with her to Miami, Aspen, the Bahamas, all while my daughter believed you were at medical conferences. How did you... I was a surgeon for 40 years. Jonathan, I learned a long time ago that the truth always leaves traces. Richard placed the photographs on the bedside table, next to the roses. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to leave this hospital. You are going to leave my daughter's life. And you are going to pray that I am merciful enough not to destroy you completely. Jonathan straightened, some of his arrogance returning. You cannot do anything to me. I am one of the best trauma surgeons in the city. I have powerful friends. You have nothing. Richard's voice was ice. You have a mistress who fakes suicide attempts to get your attention. You have a career built on the reputation of this hospital. A hospital where I have more influence than you can possibly imagine. And you have a wife who is going to wake up and learn exactly who she married. He moved toward the door, then paused. I have spent 40 years saving lives. Jonathan, I have never wanted to end one, but if you try to hurt my daughter again, if you try to take anything from her in the divorce, if you do anything other than disappear quietly from her life, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never practice medicine again. He opened the door, and that is a promise I will keep. Value lesson 2. There is an old saying that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. But here is the truth that saying does not capture. Sometimes we cannot see who people really are because we are looking at them through the lens of who we want them to be. We see the husband who brings us flowers instead of the man who silences our calls. We see the surgeon who saves lives instead of the one who lets his wife die alone. Love can be a blindfold. Trust can be a prison. And sometimes the cruelest thing someone can do is not hurt us, but simply choose someone else while we are dying. Caroline Mitchell spent 8 years married to a man she thought she knew. But the man who held his mistress's hand while Caroline's heart stopped was a stranger. He had always been a stranger. The only difference now was that the mask had finally slipped. Chapter 4. The mistress, Vanessa Cole, had been sleeping with Jonathan Mitchell for 3 years. She was not the first. She knew that now. But she had believed, foolishly, desperately, that she would be the last. They had met at a hospital fundraiser, where Vanessa worked as an assistant to the development director. Jonathan had been charming, attentive, magnetic in the way that powerful men often are. He had told her his marriage was loveless, that Caroline was cold and distant, that he stayed only out of obligation, out of fear of what a divorce would do to his career. He had told her that someday, when the time was right, they would be together openly. That had been 3 years ago, and Vanessa was still waiting. The suicide attempt had not been real, not entirely. She had taken a handful of pills, enough to scare Jonathan, to remind him that she existed, that she was tired of being hidden. She had not meant to die. She had meant to make him choose, and he had chosen. He had come to her hospital room. He had held her hand. He had whispered promises about the future, but then his phone had started ringing, and ringing, and ringing. And he had looked at the screen, seen his wife's name, and pressed decline. Again and again and again. Vanessa had watched him do it. She had watched him silence Caroline's calls while stroking Vanessa's hair, while telling her everything would be all right, while playing the devoted lover she had always wanted him to be. She had not known Caroline was dying, but Jonathan had known. He had seen the hospital's number mixed in with Caroline's calls. He had known something was wrong, and he had chosen to ignore it. That knowledge had been eating at Vanessa ever since. When Caroline Mitchell appeared at her apartment door 3 weeks after that night, Vanessa was not surprised. She had been expecting someone to come, a lawyer, perhaps, a private investigator. She had not expected Caroline herself, pale and thin, but very much alive, standing in the hallway with an expression that was not angry, but somehow worse. Curious. Searching. "You are Vanessa Cole," Caroline said. It was not a question. "Yes." "May I come in?" Vanessa stepped aside, her heart pounding. This woman had almost died because of her, because Jonathan had chosen to be with Vanessa instead of answering his phone, because Vanessa had staged a crisis to demand attention she had no right to demand. She expected screaming, accusations, violence, even instead. Caroline walked into the small apartment and sat down on the couch as if she were visiting an old friend. "I need to understand something," Caroline said quietly. "That night, when Jonathan was here with you, did you know he was ignoring my calls?" Vanessa's throat tightened. "I knew he was declining calls. I did not know you were dying. He told me it was just you being controlling. He said you called constantly when he was not home. I called 67 times because my heart was stopping." The words hung in the air between them. Vanessa felt tears burning her eyes. "I am so sorry," her voice cracked. "I know that does not mean anything. I know I cannot undo what happened. But I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know." Caroline studied her for a long moment. Vanessa saw no hatred in her eyes, only a deep, weary sadness. "Tell me about him," Caroline finally said. "Tell me who he really is, because the man I married would never have let me die alone, and I need to understand who he became." So Vanessa told her. She told Caroline about the 3 years of secret meetings, stolen weekends, whispered promises. She told her about the money Jonathan had spent, the trips they had taken, the lies he had told to keep both women believing in him. She told Caroline about the other women, the ones before Vanessa, the nurse from his residency program, the pharmaceutical rep who had lasted 6 months, the patient's daughter who had threatened to report him before Jonathan paid her to disappear. "I thought I was special," Vanessa said, her voice hollow. "I thought he was going to leave you for me. I thought when I pretended to hurt myself, he would finally realize he could not live without me. But he can live without anyone." Caroline's voice was soft. "That is the truth, is it not? He does not love. He collects, and when his collections become inconvenient, he discards them." Vanessa nodded. Unable to speak, Caroline reached out and took her hand. Two women who should have been enemies, united by the same man's betrayal. "I do not blame you," Caroline said. "I blame him. You were lied to, just like I was. What are you going to do?" Caroline's eyes hardened with something that looked like determination. "I am going to make sure he can never do this to anyone else. And I need your help." Chapter 5. The Investigation Doctor. Richard Hayes had spent 40 years in medicine. He had seen corruption, incompetence, and cruelty in every form the profession could produce. But he had never seen anything like what his investigation into Jonathan Mitchell uncovered. The forensic team he hired was the best money could buy. Former FBI agents, forensic accountants, medical investigators who specialized in cases of physician misconduct. Within 3 weeks, they had compiled a dossier that would have ended any ordinary doctor's career. But Jonathan Mitchell was not an ordinary doctor. He was a master of deception, a man who had built his entire life on lies, so carefully constructed that they were almost invisible. Almost. We found 17 instances of billing fraud over the past 5 years, the lead investigator reported, spreading documents across Richard's desk. He has been submitting claims for procedures that were either unnecessary or never performed. Total estimated fraud, over $2 million. Richard felt sick. What else? There are 3 formal complaints of sexual harassment from nurses and residents, all of which were quietly settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. The hospital's legal department handled everything. I doubt the administration even knew. They will know now. There is more. The investigator hesitated. We found evidence that Dr. Mitchell has been prescribing controlled substances to Vanessa Cole without proper documentation. She has received over 300 doses of Vicodin and Xanax in the past 2 years, all through unofficial channels. He has been drugging her. Keeping her dependent on him would be more accurate. She exhibited signs of addiction during our interview, withdrawal symptoms, mood instability. The investigator shook his head. He did not just manipulate her emotions. He manipulated her brain chemistry. Richard closed his eyes. The man his daughter had married, the surgeon he had welcomed into his family, was not just a cheater. He was a predator, a criminal, a monster wearing a white coat and a wedding ring. What about the night Caroline was admitted? Can we prove he knew? The investigator nodded slowly. We obtained his phone records from that evening. He received 67 calls from Caroline and 12 from the hospital's emergency line. The records show he manually declined each call. There is no way he did not know something was wrong. That is not just negligence, Richard said quietly. That is intentional indifference. He knew his wife might be dying, and he chose to ignore it. Yes, sir. The question is what you want to do with this information. Richard looked at the pile of documents. The evidence of fraud, harassment, illegal prescribing, calculated cruelty. Years of crimes hidden behind a charming smile and an impressive reputation. I want to destroy him, Richard said. Not just his career, his entire world. I want him to lose everything he values. And then I want him to understand that he did this to himself. The investigator nodded. That can be arranged. Lloyd, Chapter 6. 3 consecutive catastrophes. Jonathan Mitchell's world began to collapse on a Monday morning in December. The first blow came at 9:15, when he arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital for his morning surgeries and was met at the entrance by 2 men in dark suits. Dr. Mitchell, we are from the Office of Inspector General. We need to speak with you regarding allegations of Medicare fraud. Jonathan's face went white, but his voice remained steady. There must be some mistake. We have documentation of 17 fraudulent claims submitted under your name over the past 5 years. We are also investigating possible kickback arrangements with medical device companies. The federal agent handed him a business card. You will need to retain legal counsel. We recommend you do so immediately. The second blow came 3 hours later. Jonathan was in his office, frantically calling lawyers, when his department head appeared in the doorway. Dr. Mitchell, I need you to come with me. I am in the middle of now, Jonathan. He followed Dr. Chen to the hospital's administrative wing, where the chief medical officer and a team from human resources were waiting. We have received formal complaints from 3 former employees regarding your conduct, the CMO said, her voice carefully neutral. These complaints allege sexual harassment, inappropriate relationships with subordinates, and retaliatory behavior. You are being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. This is ridiculous. Those complaints were settled years ago. The settlements included non-disclosure agreements that have now been voided due to your alleged criminal conduct. The CMO slid a document across the table. Your hospital privileges are suspended effective immediately. You will surrender your ID badge and access cards before leaving the building. The third blow was the worst. That evening, Jonathan returned to the Beacon Hill townhouse to find the locks changed and his belongings piled in cardboard boxes on the front steps. Caroline opened the door before he could knock. She looked different, stronger. There was color in her cheeks and steel in her eyes that had not been there 3 weeks ago. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup. She had never looked more beautiful. "Caroline, please." Jonathan reached for her hand. "I know I made mistakes. I know you are angry, but you have to let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Explain why you let me die alone. Explain why you chose your mistress while my heart was stopping. Explain the fraud, the harassment, the drugs you have been giving Vanessa to keep her dependent on you." Jonathan's face went slack with shock. "How do you—" "My father has spent 3 weeks investigating you. We know everything, Jonathan. Every lie, every crime, every woman you have hurt." Caroline picked up one of the boxes and placed it in his arms. "The divorce papers are inside. You will sign them without contest. You will not fight for the house, the accounts, or any shared assets, and you will disappear from my life forever." "And if I refuse?" Caroline smiled, and for the first time, Jonathan saw something in her expression that frightened him. "Then my father will make sure the medical licensing board hears every detail of what you have done, and the FBI, and every journalist in Boston." She leaned closer. "You have spent your whole career building a reputation. How long do you think it will take for that reputation to be destroyed? 1 phone call? 2? Jonathan stared at her. This was not the woman he had married. This was not the quiet, trusting wife who had believed his lies for 8 years. This was someone new, someone dangerous, someone he had underestimated completely. "You cannot do this to me. I am not doing anything to you." Caroline stepped back and began to close the door. "You did this to yourself." The door shut with a soft click, and Jonathan Mitchell stood alone on the street, holding a box of his belongings, watching his entire life crumble to dust. Value Lesson 3. There is a moment in every story of betrayal when the victim must make a choice. They can become bitter. They can let the anger consume them, transform them into someone as dark and cruel as the person who hurt them. They can spend the rest of their lives seeking revenge, never realizing that revenge is a fire that burns the one who holds it. Or they can choose something different. They can choose to rebuild, to rediscover who they are outside of the relationship that defined them, to take the broken pieces of their trust and forge them into something new, something stronger, something that cannot be shattered again. Caroline Mitchell chose to rebuild, but she also chose to ensure that Jonathan Mitchell could never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. Because sometimes mercy is not letting someone escape the consequences of their actions. Sometimes mercy is making sure the fire they started only burns them. Chapter 7. The Sisterhood. Caroline found the other women through Vanessa. There were four of them, four women who had been seduced, manipulated, and discarded by Jonathan Mitchell over the past decade. Four women who had signed non-disclosure agreements and buried their pain. Four women who had never spoken to each other until now. They gathered in Caroline's living room on a Saturday afternoon in January. The winter light filtered through the tall windows as they sat in a circle, strangers united by shared betrayal. There was Dr. Megan Torres, a nurse practitioner who had worked with Jonathan during his residency. She had been 24 years old when the affair began, ambitious and naive and desperate to believe that a powerful surgeon had truly fallen in love with her. When she tried to end the relationship, Jonathan had threatened to destroy her career. She had signed the NDA to protect her future. There was Laura Chen, a pharmaceutical rep who had met Jonathan at a medical conference. Their affair had lasted 6 months before she discovered she was not the only one. When she confronted him, he had called her delusional, had convinced her colleagues she was unstable, had nearly succeeded in getting her fired. She had signed the NDA to preserve what little reputation she had left. There was Samantha Wright, the daughter of one of Jonathan's patients. Her father had died on Jonathan's operating table, and Jonathan had been there to comfort her in her grief. The affair had been brief but devastating. When Samantha realized she had been targeted in her most vulnerable moment, she had wanted to report him. But Jonathan had paid her $50,000 to stay silent, and there was Vanessa Cole, the most recent victim, still struggling with the addiction Jonathan had carefully cultivated. 5 women in total, including Caroline, 5 women whose lives had been damaged by the same man. "I have a proposal," Caroline said, looking around the circle. "Each of you signed agreements promising not to discuss what Jonathan did to you. But those agreements were signed under duress. They were designed to protect a predator, not to serve justice." "The agreements are legally binding," Megan said quietly. "If we violate them, the agreements are void." Caroline handed each woman a document. "This is an opinion from my father's legal team. When Jonathan committed federal crimes, any contracts designed to conceal his misconduct became unenforceable. You are free to tell the truth." Silence fell over the room. 5 women, holding papers that represented liberation from years of enforced silence. "What do you want us to do?" Laura asked. "I want you to testify to the Medical Licensing Board, to the federal investigators, to anyone who will listen." Caroline's voice was steady. "I want to make sure Jonathan Mitchell can never practice medicine again. And I want to make sure he cannot hide behind settlements and NDAs the next time he targets a vulnerable woman." Samantha looked down at the document in her hands. "I have spent 3 years trying to forget what he did to me, trying to convince myself it was not as bad as I remembered, that maybe I imagined the manipulation, the way he seemed to know exactly what to say to make me trust him." "You did not imagine anything," Vanessa said softly. "He did the same thing to all of us. He found our weaknesses, and he exploited them. That is who he is." "That is who he was," Caroline corrected. "He does not get to be that person anymore, not if we stand together." One by one, the women nodded. 5 strangers, 5 survivors, 5 voices that would finally be heard. The sisterhood was complete. Chapter 8. The Hearing. The Medical Licensing Board hearing took place on a cold morning in February. Jonathan Mitchell sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, a high-priced lawyer from one of Boston's most prestigious firms. He was wearing his best suit, his expression composed and confident. He believed as he had always believed, that his charm and his credentials would be enough to save him. He was wrong. The prosecution began with the financial evidence: Medicare fraud totaling over $2 million, falsified surgical records, kickbacks from device manufacturers that had influenced his treatment recommendations. Then came the women. Megan Torres testified about the affair, the threats, the way Jonathan had used his position to silence her. She spoke quietly but clearly, her voice never wavering as she described the man who had manipulated her at 24 years old. Laura Chen testified about the harassment campaign Jonathan had launched when she tried to leave him, the lies he had told her colleagues, the way he had systematically destroyed her professional reputation. Samantha Wright testified about being targeted in her moment of greatest vulnerability, when she was grieving her father's death. She described how Jonathan had seemed so kind, so understanding, so perfectly calibrated to exploit her pain. Vanessa Cole testified about the pills, the prescriptions Jonathan had written without documentation, keeping her dependent on him, ensuring she would never have the strength to leave. And finally, Caroline Mitchell testified about the night her heart stopped. "I called my husband 67 times, she said, her voice steady. "I called because I was dying and I needed help. He declined every call because he was with his mistress at another hospital. He chose to hold her hand while my heart stopped beating for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. The hearing room was silent. My father saved my life that night, but Jonathan did not know my father would be there. He had no reason to believe anyone would save me." Caroline looked directly at her husband. "He let me die alone, and if I had died, he would have collected my life insurance, mourned me publicly for an appropriate period, and then married Vanessa Cole." Jonathan's attorney objected. "That is speculation. There is no evidence my client intended. There is evidence." Caroline produced a document. "This is an email Jonathan sent to Vanessa Cole 3 months before my heart attack. In it, he discusses his plans to divorce me after, quote, a suitable tragedy occurs. End quote. He mentions the life insurance policy he took out on me without my knowledge. He discusses how long he should wait before making their relationship public." The room erupted. Jonathan's face went white. He turned to his attorney, whispered something urgent, but it was too late. The evidence was already in the hands of the board members. "I did not mean that literally," Jonathan said, rising to his feet. "It was a figure of speech. I would never." "Sit down, Dr. Mitchell." The board chairman's voice was ice. "You will have an opportunity to respond, but I suggest you consider your words very carefully." The hearing lasted 3 more hours. Character witnesses testified to Jonathan's arrogance, his dismissiveness, his pattern of bullying behavior toward nurses and junior doctors. Colleagues described a culture of fear in his department. Patients who had experienced complications spoke about being pressured to sign documents absolving Jonathan of responsibility. By the end, the portrait was complete, not a brilliant surgeon who made a few mistakes, a predator who had spent decades exploiting his position, his power, and the trust of everyone around him. The board's decision was unanimous. Dr. Jonathan Mitchell's medical license was permanently revoked. He would never practice medicine again. Chapter 9. Justice. The criminal trial took place 6 months later. Jonathan was charged with Medicare fraud, illegal prescribing of controlled substances, and multiple counts of witness tampering related to his attempts to silence the women who had spoken against him. The prosecution was led by an assistant U.S. attorney who had made his career prosecuting corrupt physicians. He presented the case with methodical precision, building a narrative of greed, manipulation, and callous disregard for human life. The defense argued that Jonathan was being railroaded by a vindictive father-in-law who had abused his connections to destroy an innocent man. They painted Caroline as a bitter ex-wife. They suggested that Vanessa and the other women were scorned lovers seeking revenge. The jury did not believe them. After 4 days of deliberation, they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Caroline sat in the front row of the courtroom when the verdict was read. She did not cry. She did not celebrate. She simply listened as the word guilty was repeated again and again, watching Jonathan's face as he finally understood that his charm, his credentials, his expensive lawyers could not save him from the truth. The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. Judge Patricia Winters, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for severity in cases involving abuse of professional trust, looked at Jonathan for a long moment before speaking. "Dr. Mitchell, you have been convicted of crimes that represent a profound betrayal of your oath as a physician. You swore to do no harm. Instead, you harmed everyone who trusted you. Your patients, your colleagues, your wife, the women you manipulated and discarded." Jonathan stood before the bench, his arrogance finally completely gone. He looked smaller than he had ever looked, older, broken. "You used your position to steal from the healthcare system that trusted you. You used your access to controlled substances to keep a vulnerable woman dependent on you. And when your wife was dying, you chose to let her die alone because she was inconvenient to your plans." The judge leaned forward. "This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You will pay full restitution to Medicare and to every patient you defrauded. Your assets will be seized to compensate your victims." She paused. "And when you are released, you will be a convicted felon, unable to practice medicine, unable to prescribe so much as an aspirin. The career you valued more than human life is over, forever." 12 years. Jonathan would be 60 years old when he got out. His medical career destroyed, his reputation gone, his freedom taken. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at Caroline one last time. She met his eyes without flinching, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she felt nothing at all. Chapter 10. New Beginnings 2 years later. Caroline stood in the lobby of the Richard Hayes Cardiac Center. The building was her design, her dream made real in glass and steel and healing spaces, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to cardiac care, with a special focus on women's heart health, funded by the settlement she had received from Jonathan's seized assets. Her father stood beside her, leaning on his cane but stronger than he had been in years. His retirement had been postponed indefinitely. He was too busy training the next generation of cardiac surgeons, too busy ensuring that his legacy would continue long after he was gone. "It is beautiful," Richard said, looking at the building that bore his name. "Your mother would have been so proud. She would have been proud of you." Elizabeth Hayes, Caroline's mother, had passed away 6 months after Jonathan's sentencing. A sudden stroke, quick and painless. She had lived long enough to see justice served, long enough to know her daughter was safe, long enough to tell Caroline how much she loved her one last time. Caroline missed her every day, but she also carried her mother's strength inside her, a flame that could not be extinguished by grief or loss or betrayal. "The women are here," Richard said, nodding toward a group approaching the entrance. Megan Torres, Laura Chen, Samantha Wright, Vanessa Cole. The Sisterhood of Survivors gathered to celebrate the opening of a facility that would help prevent others from suffering as they had. They embraced Caroline one by one, these women who had been strangers 2 years ago and were now family. "How does it feel?" Vanessa asked. She was clean now, 18 months sober, working as a counselor at an addiction treatment center. The pills Jonathan had used to control her were no longer part of her life. "It feels like closure," Caroline said. "It feels like a beginning." The dedication ceremony drew over 200 people: doctors, nurses, patients, community leaders, people who believed in the mission of the center, who understood that healthcare should be about healing, not exploitation. Caroline spoke last. "3 years ago, I almost died," she said, standing at the podium, looking out at the crowd. "My heart stopped for 4 minutes and 32 seconds while my husband ignored my calls. I should have died alone in our apartment." Another statistic, another victim of a heart attack that came too suddenly to survive. She paused, collecting herself. "But I did not die. My father saved my life that night. And in the months that followed, I discovered that the man I had married was not who I believed him to be. He was a fraud, a predator, a criminal who had spent decades hiding behind his credentials and his charm." She looked at the sisterhood, gathered in the front row. "But I also discovered something else. I discovered that I was not alone, that there were other women who had been hurt by the same man, other victims who had been silenced by fear and settlements and shame. And when we found each other, when we stood together and told the truth, we discovered that our voices were powerful enough to bring down even the most protected predator." Caroline smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in what felt like years. "This center is dedicated to healing, to saving lives, to ensuring that no woman ever has to die alone because someone who should have protected her chose not to." She looked up at the building, at the name carved in stone above the entrance. "But it is also dedicated to something else, to the truth, to the courage it takes to speak the truth when powerful people want you to stay silent, to the sisterhood of survivors who prove that we are stronger together than we could ever be alone." She raised her glass. "To healing, to justice, to new beginnings." The crowd echoed her toast. And somewhere in a federal prison, Jonathan Mitchell was beginning the third of 4,380 days behind bars. Every single one of them deserved final value lesson. Here is what I want you to remember from this story. The people who hurt us do not define us. The betrayals we survive do not diminish us. The lies we believed do not make us foolish. They make us human. Caroline Mitchell spent 8 years married to a man who was capable of letting her die alone. But when she discovered the truth, she did not let that truth destroy her. She used it. She transformed her pain into purpose, her anger into action, her isolation into sisterhood. She built something beautiful from the wreckage of her marriage, a center that saves lives, a community of survivors who support each other, a legacy that will outlast the man who tried to destroy her. That is the real revenge, not destruction, creation, not hatred, healing, not silence, truth. If you are watching this and you have been hurt by someone you trusted, I want you to know that your story is not over. The person who betrayed you does not get to write your ending. You do. And that ending can be beautiful. Closing CTA. If this story moved you, If you believe that karma always finds its way to those who deserve it, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more stories of justice, survival, and new beginnings coming your way. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think should happen to people like Jonathan Mitchell. And share this story with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth always comes out. Always.